Are we on? Are we on?
Yes, we are.
Good evening. This is Professor Aminah Al-Deen with Critical Talk, which is a production of Muslim Network TV. A very belated Eid Mubarak to those listening who fasted during the month of Ramadan, and a good evening to everyone else. I have the express pleasure of speaking with Dr. Maria Dakake, who researches and publishes on Islamic intellectual history, Quranic studies, Shiite and Sufi traditions, and women's spirituality and religious experience. She is one of the general editors and contributing authors of the Study Quran. And we'll bring up a picture of that for you to look at in a moment, which comprises a translation and verse, ayah by ayah commentary on the Quran text that draws upon the rich and varied tradition of Muslim commentary on their own scripture. Uh, the most recent publication, um, and I don't see the rest of it, but there's a Routledge companion. I am excited by this text because it is really formulated in such a way that it becomes a study Quran. Welcome, Dr. Dakake.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Oh, the pleasure is all ours. And I sent you, I had a gazillion plus 7 questions, and trying to whittle them down was quite a task. But uh, you're at George Mason. Um, why did your group, well, first of all, how did a group come together
Mhm.
to think a Quran like this was necessary? When we have so many now, the choice becomes, oh, this English is better than that English.
Right. Well, to answer your question, it began actually with the publisher, with HarperCollins. So HarperCollins publishes a study Bible,
Mm.
and they have a study Torah. They were doing a study Bhagavad Gita at the time, and they decided that they needed a study Quran. So they reached out to Dr. Sayyid Hossein Nasser and asked if he would put a team together to produce a study Quran. And so that's how it began. And so Dr. Nas reached out to me, and I had known him for a long time. My husband had studied with him many years ago, and of course, we were all in the Islamic studies field here in the Washington, D.C., Northern Virginia area. And so he reached out to me and some other people, and he asked if I could give him a list of names of people who he thought would be good contributors to the project. And so I gave him a list of names that did not include myself. um,
Why you backed out?
I'm sorry.
I said you backed out, huh?
Well, I didn't, I didn't put myself, I didn't think of myself, primarily in this particular role. And so he thanked me for the names, and then he came back to me a few weeks later and asked if I would be part of the team. So the two, it started actually with just two other general editors, Joseph Lombard and John Ardagle, who had both worked with Dr. Nass either directly. Joseph Lombard did his undergraduate degree at George Washington University, and Dr. Nasser was on the advisory board, or I shouldn't say advisory board, on the thesis committee for Dr. Dagle. So he decided that it would start with the three of us. And actually, the first thing we started out trying to do was to find a translation that we wanted to use for the main text, because the purpose of the project was to provide annotation and commentary.
Mm.
The problem was, after trying very hard, we realized it would be quite difficult to use any of the existing translations, in part because we would spend a lot of time explaining another translator's word choice,
Yeah.
which would waste time. And we thought, since it's a study Quran, we're going to have a lot of annotation and commentary. It should be literal. It should be as close to the literal as possible so that the commentary makes sense. And so we went back to the publisher and said, we think first we need to do a translation. So we did the translation first.
How long did that take?
That took about 3 years, dividing it up.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, what was difficult is, translating by committee, because, the Quran has so many phrases that are very, very similar or identical. And we had to make sure that we basically divided it up so that we were each doing about 10 ajza, or 10 sections of the Quran. But we had to make it so that it sounded consistent, because, of course, the three of us had very different English styles as well,
Mm-hmm.
and we didn't want it to sound like three different styles. So it took a long time to produce it. Of course, basing it very much on existing translations, but trying to make it as literal as possible, so that when we presented the commentary that would explain this phrase or that phrase, it would be clear to the reader what they were referring to.
Ooh.
So we did that, and then once we had a translated text that we all felt comfortable with, then we began doing the researching the commentaries to produce the annotation and the summative commentary that we have in attached to the various verses in the text.
Okay, I'm going to ask my producer to put up the cover. I can't see any of this, but if you would put up the cover for the study Quran, so that our audience, this is not a terribly expensive text that you can't go get. Um, it does feel, however, like a tome that, if it wasn't the Quran, you could use as a doorstop because it's heavy. But it is a beautifully presented text. Is it up yet?
It is up. I can see it.
Okay. And if you notice, Miriam, do you have a page? And you could just let me know when it's up.
I want to give credit as well to John Ardagle, because he did a lot of the artistic elements as well. In
Oh,
terms,
wonderful.
he really did an amazing job.
Yes. One of the things that is outstanding, for those of you in the audience, you open the Quran, the Arabic is on one side, the English and all of its various expressions is on the other side. And then at the bottom of the page, you have tafsir. And you kind of say, is this all there is? And it's usually selected tafsir, either from the culture of the person who's providing the translations, or some choices that translator has made in other places. But here we have something different. Maria, can you talk about what's at the spaces that we normally see tafsir?
Yes, so when we were, I should also mention we eventually brought on a Dr. Muhammad Rustam as well when we realized the commentary would be a lot to do. So he assisted us with the commentary and did a number of the surahs. But what we wanted to try to do was to bring a representative collection of commentary on the Quran that would come from a range of traditions. We wanted to, of course, make sure that that really critical information that you find in tafsir, like the context, the asbab nuzul, the context in which the verses came down, what they're considered to refer to, any unusual phrases or words that are particularly significant, the legal significance of the verse or the theological significance. We wanted to make sure that we represented that. And then we wanted to present a representative sample of the different types of commentary that had been made on that particular verse. And we wanted it to be broad. We included traditional commentaries. We included both Sunni and Shi commentaries. We included Sufi commentaries. We included modern commentaries. It depended on very much on the verse itself, right? But we wanted to make sure that whoever read the text would have a clear understanding of how Muslim scholars have traditionally understood the verses of the Quran, even if they didn't always agree on the meaning or they didn't always agree even on the context exactly. We wanted to give them a set of parameters. This is what has been thought about the Quran. This is the tradition of how the Quran has been understood. So to give them a kind of solid foundation for engaging the Quran on their own, for understanding it on their own, not to provide one single definitive interpretation, but to lay that foundation of knowledge. Because, of course, the tafsir are not really accessible to most people today, Muslim
Exactly.
or non-Muslim. They're in many, many volumes. They're in difficult Arabic or Persian or Ottoman Turkish. They're in
Mhm.
a handful of libraries that many people don't have access to, usually academic libraries. So they're very inaccessible. And we felt it was very important to try to make this accessible to the ordinary reader of the Quran, whether they be a Muslim trying to understand the Quran better for their own a student or lay person, educated person, a person who has some interest in the Quran but no background. We wanted it to be something that would allow people from a range of different levels of education and engagement, from different religious perspectives or secular perspectives, to be able to read the Quran and understand how it fits into the Muslim tradition of understanding the Quran itself, its ritual, its laws, its theology, its intellectual history.
Well, I think that that's awesome, and that's what as soon as it came out, I bought one, and I was astounded. I said, "Oh my goodness, all of it in one place!" Um, that is such an enormous um, work. Tell us a little bit. Well, wait a minute. It took 3 years plus to do the translation. How many more years did it take to gather? And was there a selection of the commentary?
Yes, the whole project took between about 8.5 years
Oh my
altogether.
goodness. Mm.
And so the commentary, we had the publisher really wanted it to be in one volume. And so we had a general rule, we couldn't stick to it, but as an average, we thought for every line of text in the Quran, we could have 7 lines of commentary. So I would, what I would do practically every day is go down into my study and I would do maybe between 3 and 5 verses a day, because for every verse I would go and I would look at 7 or 8 commentaries, and I would have to read the commentary on that verse from all of these different these different tafsir, and try to decide what were the most common threads that we find running through the different commentaries, or what is something that was particularly insightful, maybe unusual, but really interesting and important, to include that. We wanted to make sure that the verse itself would be very understandable.
Right,
Quran can be figurative in its language, it can be elliptical. Sometimes it starts a sentence and doesn't finish it. So
right,
we wanted to try to make sure that it was understandable, that it was put in its context, and then whoever was reading it would understand how it was the range of ways in which it was traditionally understood in the Islamic tradition. And as I was doing it, every verse I was thinking to myself, you know, what should a Muslim, know about this verse? What should a student in an undergraduate class know about this verse? What would my colleagues, who are Islamic studies scholars, but maybe want to use the text as a shorthand? Let's say they want to do a research project that involves a certain passage of the
mm,
Quran. I wanted to make sure that I included things that would say, all right, they could see that, all right, I need to go and check Tabari for this, or I need to go and check Ibn Kathir, or I need to check Ibn Ajiba, or, so it was you know, had all of those different audiences in my mind when I was producing it. And then I had to try to distill the information into something that was compact enough that we wouldn't exceed what could be put in a single volume.
wow. Let us take a quick, let's say, 2-minute break. And I would like for you, um, hmm, it's so much in this. Um, to talk about let's go back to the content, because this is unusual in the completeness of the content that's at the end. All of them, well, not all, but some of the Qurans come with best approaches, a little bit of history, but this is a little bit more complete than that. And so when we come back, I'd like to talk about that, because there are articles about the Arabic, the articles about how to best read it. You have an article on ethics that I love, and I really want to go back to. So let's take a 2-minute break. This is Professor Aminah Al-Deen. I'm here having a wonderful conversation with Professor Maria Dakake about the study Quran. We'll be right back. Are we ready to go back on? Hello?
Yes.
This is terrible. Hello, this is Professor Aminah Al-Deen with Critical Talk, a production of Muslim Network TV, and I'm having a wonderful conversation with Dr. Maria Dakake on the study Quran. One of the things, Dr. Maria, that I got a little cut off because the full text is not online for me, is that you have a recent publication, the Routledge Companion to what?
To the Quran.
When is it coming out?
It's out. It came out last fall, last October.
Now, why don't I have a copy? Okay, you owe me big time, lady. Let us go back. And it's not that, well, it is that this is unique. And Miriam, can you put up a copy of the context page? Contents, I'm sorry. Because we have approaching the study Quran, understanding the citations and commentary. And but we also have these um, appendices which have some really good stuff in them. Um, Wait a minute, let me look at mine here. We have articles on, well, they're essays actually. How to Read the Quran by Ingrid Masson, the Quran in Translation, the Islamic View of the Quran, Quranic Arabic, Quranic Commentaries, your own chapter which looks at Quranic ethics. Uh, William Chittick was a good friend of mine, the Quran and Sufism. I mean, this is just awesome. And Hamza Yusuf on death, dying, and the afterlife. And these are essays very worthwhile reading, ladies and gentlemen. So, you want to tell us about why these essays? What made these important? And why were they chosen?
When we were thinking about presenting the Quran, we realized that there were some larger issues that we couldn't really sufficiently present in the commentary, the verse by verse commentary. So, for
Mhm.
example, issues um, around chronic ethics, issues around warfare in the Quran, right? Sort of issues that always come up in typical conversations. What is the nature of Quranic Arabic? How do you approach reading the Quran? What is the role of the Quran in Islamic law? And so we felt that in order to really understand the commentary, it was also important to have these essays that would present more holistically the role of the Quran, these different aspects
Yeah.
of the Islamic tradition, its influence, its foundational nature for all of these other aspects of the Islamic tradition, that would be important in a preparatory way. We had initially thought they would be at the beginning. Decision was made to put them, at the end, so they didn't interfere with,
Mm.
the Quran itself. But really, they're meant to be preparatory and supplementary, especially for people who aren't familiar with the Muslim tradition more broadly.
Well, I think that that is outstanding, mostly because for those of us, and I'm retired now, but you're still teaching, people want to draw students into classes and they need to have some sort of reasonable access, and essays on many of the questions that they have about the Quranic sect, itself, the central text. But you've written a companion. What am I going to do in this companion? Because I'm going to get it. Can you find it? Miriam, and pull it up because I'm going to get it today.
But I didn't write it, I have to say, it's an edited volume, so
Okay, that's fine.
I have 2 there's 40, it's very large, I didn't realize it would be so large, it's actually larger than the study Quran, um,
Oh, no.
but it's 40 articles, by scholars working from different perspectives, so I co-edited it with Daniel Madigan at Georgetown University. It started with the 2 of us together, and then, we ended up working with, one of his graduate students who graduated, is now a professor in Iowa, George Archer, focuses on the Quran. So the idea was to look at the broader field of Quranic studies, to recognize that you have all of these different methodologies, historical methodologies, literary methodologies for approaching the Quran, and to give, again, a sample of these different types of ways of looking at the Quran from a scholarly tradition, to give an overview of the broader discipline of Quranic studies. And the volume is divided into 3 parts. It's called the first part is the world before the Quran, then the world of the Quran, and the world after the Quran. So the
Mm,
first, part sets the scene. It talks about there's sort of 3 articles, one of which was written by myself, that tells you what was happening in the Near East in the 7th century, what was happening in Arabia, what was happening specifically in Mecca and Medina, in the areas where, the Prophet Muhammad was born and lived, his life. And then we have the world of the Quran, which gets into the text. We have chapters on particular prophets in the Quran, on the concept of human nature in the Quran, on the concept of the afterlife in the Quran. And then we have in those are just some examples. And then in the world after the Quran, we have different types of commentary, articles that talk about different types of commentary on the Quran and different ways in which the Quran has influenced aspects
mm.
of Islamic culture, from theology to law to popular culture and so on.
Wow, I'm getting this book. You said it's bigger and thicker. Okay.
It is.
um, but I think that they are necessary, not only for people who wish to teach it, whether they're teaching it in a weekend school or in the university, but also for the everyday person. Tackle it. And the book gives you a plan for tackling it and addresses some of the concerns that readers, especially those who are newly transitioning to Islam, but some of the old folks who are saying, I give, I'll just read the verses. So, what else? Is there going to be another edition of this?
Well, actually, right now in the works is an edition that I don't really know how they're going to do this, but somehow they're going to include the Arabic,
Ah,
the original Arabic text, which I think will
what
be
is
very useful
it?
actually for people who know how to read the Quran. You know, a lot of Muslims, as you know, can phonetically read the Quran, are trained to read the Quran, but now they can do that along with, having the translation and having the commentary
Hmm.
along with it.
Well, they're not going to have the transliteration also in there, right?
That's true, that's true. So it would, because of course there are copies of the Quran that have that
Right,
transliteration
I have some of those.
as
Yeah.
well, and I don't think we could fit that. They say they're still gonna get it in one volume.
Oh no.
When I I'll believe it when I see it, but, but that's the idea, and they wanted it to be one volume because they wanted it to be something that could be used in classrooms and that kind of thing.
Well, you can use two. Oh, okay. Well, I've we're getting near the end of this show, but I want to spend some time on the essay you wrote on Quranic ethics. Of course, that was my area in grad school, and it gets not enough treatment because the preference, of course, is strictly the law in its narrow, yes and no and right, left foot, right foot. But I want to go to that particular essay and tell us about the principles that you pulled out for us to be reminded of.
Mhm. Yes, I one of the things that, as you said, when people think about the Islamic tradition in a kind of general way, they think about the do's and don'ts, and they think about this is allowed, that's not allowed, and so on. Of course, Muslim scholars have long thought about the law in broader categories,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't think that's always obvious to people. And what I wanted to do was to show how all of, for example, with if we're talking about economic ethics, how is it that, what are the underlying social goods, social principles that were really important to the Quran, and how that can explain the law of inheritance, the laws against usury, the importance of charity. Right? If you can look at each one of those legal traditions or legal rulings or sets of rulings independently, but you can see how altogether they are based on a principle of ensuring that the wealth within the Muslim community continues to circulate, that it doesn't get tied up, that the fact that you have to divide your inheritance, the fact that you have to give charity as a responsibility, the fact that you can't take usury, all of this, the fact that the Quran just says often to spend, and it means in charity, but also spend, right? In other words, don't be miserly, don't hold on to that. There's enough for everybody, if people were to allow it to circulate. So I think it's important to do that. And of course, with family law, same thing, right? The Quran sees the family unit as essential to the moral life and as the basis of the community. And of course, you can look at family law from the point of view of what it says about women, right? Of course, the Quran emerges in a context where patriarchy is everywhere in the world, right? It's,
Like
practically
today, yes.
and today, yes. And so, how does the Quran address that? How does it try to create situations of justice within the limitation of the existing social order in which it is today? So instead of looking at them individually, looking at them as a means of trying to create a particular kind of just society, again, imagining a moral society. And I remind my students often that you have to think about the context in which the Quran emerges, right? In Arabia, it's a wild place. There's no law, there's
Oh,
no
yeah.
security, there's no anything. And the Quran is trying to affect a full social moral change in the way people think.
Yeah.
It's trying to create a community that will voluntarily create a kind of security for itself through respect for neighbor, through the creation of families, and so on. And so I often say that it's important to understand those larger principles, especially because if we're thinking about the contemporary world and the way things have changed, as you say, there's still patriarchy, of course, but the world is a different world, and we have a different understanding. But to understand those underlying principles will
Mm.
help contemporary Muslims and non-Muslims who want to understand the Muslim way of life to see how how those principles can be applied, those statements in the Quran can be applied in a way that stays true to those larger principles.
That's especially, we meet it often in the classroom where students are trying to take modern questions back to the 7th century. And I
Mhm.
said, well, they had their questions too. They may
Mhm.
not have encompassed all that you're thinking about, but they had their sets of questions. But let's go for the underlying principle and see how we can apply it today. because the Abu Sulaiman Center is working very hard to bring just little pieces of the Muslim world here to Americans, because the American scholars are focused on Western scholarship, as you said in a conversation we had earlier. And don't there is very little application of any of the ethical principles into perhaps solutions or resolutions or mediation even.
Right. Yeah, I think that understanding those, and of course, my colleague, Dr. Abdulaziz Sachedina, has written a great deal about Islamic
Mhm.
ethics in relation to the law. But I do think it's important to have these larger principles, because when you take them together, you understand it helps you situate all the things that the Quran says in a way that makes sense. You see the larger, as I said, social moral project
Yeah,
that the
that's
Quran is
it.
trying to affect. And you know, again, when we sort of put this synopsis of the commentaries in the attached it to the translation, right, in annotation, the point was not to say this is where interpretation stops.
Right.
But to say this is the foundation, right, from which contemporary Muslims can try to make sure they're sort of educated in the basic tradition, the history, the way in which it's been traditionally understood, and use that as a foundation for engaging with the Quran on their own. One of the things that, as a professor of Islamic studies at George Mason University, you may know George Mason University has a quite substantial Muslim student population, in part because Northern Virginia has a large Muslim student population. So in my classes, for example, on the Quran, often, at least 50% of the students are themselves heritage students. They come in one way or the next from the Muslim tradition.
Hmm.
And I would often put up verses of the Quran, or we would look together at passages from the Quran, and I would say, what do you understand from this? What do you see? And a lot of my Muslim students would say, well, we're not really qualified to say. You need to rely on the traditional commentaries.
Hmm.
And I understand that perspective, of course, but at the same time, I feel like it created a barrier between them and the Quranic text. It sort of prevented them from
Yeah,
really engaging. And
exactly.
so one of the things I was hoping would come out of the study Quran was that if they felt they had a set of, you know, this is how it has been understood
Mhm.
in, the long history of Muslim commentary, it would give them some parameters, within which they felt like they could really engage the Quran on their own. Because the Quran says, itself, it encourages people to think about it, to use their
Mhm.
intelligence, to contemplate it.
Mhm.
And so, but at the same time, you don't want to have interpretive anarchy. You don't want to have people, saying it can mean anything. And so this is a way to kind of ground people's own independent engagement with the Quran.
But minus that kind of look, you do have interpretive anarchy, because culture is interpreting. I mean, various ideologies are interpreting. So we're kind of in that anarchy despite our best intentions.
Well, there is a tradition that's been variously attributed to Abdullah ibn Mas'ud and also to Ali ibn Abi Talib, that says that the Quran has every part of the Quran has four aspects: an outward, an inward, a limit, right, a head, and then a matla, which means like a kind of
Hmm.
high point, lookout point, right?
Yeah.
And one of the interpretations for what that matla is, according to Ali, is what it means for the individual reading it. right?
Yeah.
So there's the outward meaning, the inward meaning, there's the limits, right? It can't mean anything. But then there's also what it means for each individual person who's reading it. And I say to my students that if you're reading, you're interpreting.
Yeah.
If you're reading and you're paying
Oh
attention
my
at all,
goodness.
you're interpreting.
Exactly, exactly.
And you're translating the words on the page to ideas in your mind. And so, it's important to have that individual engagement. But when with anarchy, I would try to avoid anarchy in the sense that you want to have a certain, like, the word can't mean anything.
Ex
One word in the Quran might mean many different things, but it can't mean anything.
tell you how many times I've said that sentence. A word can't mean anything. Get that out. Yeah. Ah, well, well, maybe what we can encourage the center to do is to have a roundtable discussion on this text with students invited, of course, to sit at the table, not behind the table,
Mhm.
and voice their opinions on what is the aim here, because it's really important. This is, I think, an exciting book that needs to be just studied, as with
Mhm.
why it's called the Study Quran.
Mhm.
I am enjoying it. It'll take me a minute, and now that you've got me getting a companion that is large,
I promise my next book, no more than 100 pages.
oh my God. And we have a couple of more minutes,
Mm.
and I want to quickly say that Dr. Dakake has done an audio book on the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Could you just give us a little blurb?
Sure. So the audiobook is based in part on a course that I teach called The Prophet Muhammad Life and Legacy at George Mason. And so it's 10 episodes. Each episode is about a half an hour long. So the first five are a retelling of his life based on the various traditional Sira accounts of his life. And then the remaining five episodes have to do with how that memory of his life has influenced the Muslim tradition. So we look at, again, sort of what this means for books like what's the relationship between the Sirah or the biographies of the Prophet Muhammad and the Hadith tradition. How
Mm,
does this affect the devotional tradition that Muslims have toward the Prophet Muhammad? What is the Shiite reading
mm.
of this history? How does this history affect current Muslim? How does the Prophet's life, let's say, in his relationships with women, how does that affect current understandings of morality regarding gender relations? The way that the prophet lived his life as the leader of a leader of a community that sometimes had to engage in warfare. How has that affected Muslim understandings?
Right,
So, looking at the way in which this biography of the prophet, which of course never becomes canonical, there isn't one canonical,
right.
account of the Prophet Muhammad's life, but it's a retelling of that, and then again, a look at how his life has been understood, interpreted, how it's influenced Islamic morality, sociality, devotional traditions, over, going right up until the modern period.
So, for those who don't have the privilege and honor of being in one of your classes, where can they get it?
It's a product of a partnership between the Great Courses program and the Audible Originals book. So if you go to the Audible Originals website and you look up either my name, or I think the title is Life and Legacy of the Prophet Muhammad, you'll be able to find it there.
I can't thank you enough I am so honored to know you, and I'm going to get free copies of all of this good stuff. But
For sure.
been such a pleasure. Oh my God. And I was taking notes for future conversations.
Wonderful.
This is Professor Aminah Al-Deen with Critical Talk, which is a product of Muslim Network TV. Hopefully, you're listening to us on YouTube or any of the other places that are live streaming us. I've been talking with Dr. Maria Dakake, who does much more than what I read off in a little CV of her. Follow her, find her. We know where we can get this audio version of the Prophet's life. There's the study Quran. They had the audacity to make a companion that is larger. So we got lots of stuff to do. And I want to thank you again.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful talking with you.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa